There are some who would say that any understanding of rights needs to be grounded in some particular ethical ideology. That is, that there can be no consistent understanding of rights without first establishing what the good is according to some particular doctrine. I disagree. Here I will argue that rights, as a concept, precede morality, and that a firm understanding of natural rights needs to be established before it is possible to accurately discuss concepts such as morality, virtue, goodness. Indeed, in the words of Ayn Rand, the moral is the chosen. An individual cannot act morally unless he chooses to perform an act with good consequences. Because if he does not choose such an act, but performs it because he has been compelled to do so, no kind of agency on his part was involved. Indeed, he was just the pawn of the person who ordered him. So, if a person forces me to perform a moral act, a kind act, an honest act, then it is not I who am the moral agent of that act. It is the person who has forced me. He is simply using me as a tool to exercise his own understanding of what is good. Indeed, imposing allegedly moral behavior through any kind of coercive channel deprives the vast majority of people of the chance to be moral. Because the only way in which any individual can truly be moral is if he chooses of his own free will to undertake a particular action, without being forced or prodded to do so by somebody else. Now, somebody has to ultimately make the choice whether morality is free and open to each individual to exercise, or whether some view of the good is imposed on everyone by force. But where some view of the good is imposed on everyone by force, only the very few people who impose it have a chance to actually be moral and act morally. And history shows that those people inevitably make some of the most immoral decisions. Indeed, more people have been killed by governments than have ever been killed by private criminals. More people have been killed from ideological motives than they have from conventional immorality, as most people consider it. Greed, lust. Those kinds of motives result in a fraction of the deaths and a fraction of the suffering that governmental imposition and government coercion results in. Furthermore, imposing allegedly moral behavior makes it difficult to distinguish truly virtuous people from people who are just following orders. That is to say, if a government or some kind of group of individuals who think that they know better decides to impose its will on others by force and compel everybody to act in a certain way, then it's impossible to distinguish, even if the imposition itself is the imposition to do a good deed, whether the people who are doing that deed would have done it otherwise. That's a counterfactual claim that we cannot verify in a given situation. We cannot say, well, this person actually chose to do good and he is therefore a good person. He could be just following orders. The physical behavior that we observe would be the same. So in its quest to impose virtue, any kind of group of individuals that advocates coercion is actually going to make virtue very difficult to distinguish in practice. And it is going to give people no incentive to think about morality or to make moral choices themselves. Why should they, when the government is going to decide what they are going to have to do, irrespective of what choice they make? Therefore, a firm understanding of rights is needed before the question of morality can even legitimately arise. If an individual does not have the freedom to choose to do good, and that also entails the freedom to choose to to do a damaging act to himself, to choose to do an irresponsible act in certain cases, and of course the freedom to suffer the consequences, then it is impossible to say that that individual has any kind of moral agency, unless it be the moral agency that enables him to resist the coercive impositions under which he suffers. Without being able to make a choice, morality has no bearing on an individual's life or on his behavior. Now, granted, there are some kinds of actions that we cannot leave open to choice, precisely because the choices made in those circumstances necessarily limit the ability of other people to make choices regarding their own moral agency. For instance, murder. If one person murders another, the person who has been murdered now cannot choose to do anything, including to act morally or immorally. However, when an individual's choice harms only that individual himself, and I am not talking about indirect consequences, because every action has indirect consequences somewhere, somehow, and can be interpreted as such. I am talking about direct harms that stem immediately from the action being performed. If those harms are absent, then the individual should have the ability to make an immoral choice. Now, I allege that giving individuals the ability to make that immoral choice will actually foster morality in the long run, because individuals learn from their past actions. If an individual takes drugs to such an extent that those drugs inhibit his ability to earn a living, inhibit his relationships with his friends and his family, and there is no governmental social safety net to bail him out, that individual is going to recognize the consequences of drug abuse very quickly. And in most cases, he will strive to avoid those negative consequences in the future, and he will try to limit or altogether eliminate that abuse. But any kind of legislation of morality inevitably has unintended consequences. Either that individual doesn't even think about the consequences, he's a good citizen and he obeys the law, whatever the law says, and that's the end of it. Or, as more commonly happens with persons who are less law-abiding, he tries to violate the law nonetheless, and that prohibition channels him into more perverse and more immoral behaviors than he otherwise would have performed. Hence, what would have been drug consumption that is surely damaging to one's health, but is not harmful in other senses, has developed into a black market filled with theft, murder, fear. Indeed, even many of the drugs that are sold on this black market are far more damaging to individuals' health than the drugs that would be sold on a free market, because on the black market, dealers have no incentive to keep the drugs pure, and therefore individuals who take the drugs are much more likely to suffer from harmful side effects. Furthermore, any kind of imposition of allegedly moral behavior is costly. Somebody has to pay for it, and most frequently, the people who pay for it are not the people who commit the alleged infractions. They're the people who don't commit the alleged infractions. The honest, productive majority of the population that pays taxes in order to fund the hubristic and extravagant attempts of governmental officials or other coercive parties to impose their view of the good on everybody else. And that is not a sustainable situation. That is not a moral situation. Indeed, it is the ultimate immorality. It is the exertion of force by some people upon others. It is the deprivation of the choice to which every individual is entitled. The choice to live a good life or to live a bad life, to act morally or immorally, to discover what is true and what is good for himself through his thinking mind and his status as a human being. That is the most sacred and inalienable status that one can have. And to all of you coercers out there, don't mess with it.